our opponents, not opponent, may have won this round at this time in this place. But this will be a battle for our humanity and justice for the rest of our lives.
Tonight we turn a page and we say that we believe in inclusion of everybody. And our representation. That you are included no matter what your demographic is.
The results are in for the most expensive House primary race in U.S. history. Congressman Jamaal Bowman lost his primary in New York, defeated by moderate Democrat George Latimer. Bowman is the first incumbent Democrat to lose this election cycle. His loss highlighting a divide in the Democratic Party over the war in the Middle East, and the first defeat for a member of the progressive House squad. It's also a major victory for pro-Israel groups that backed Latimer, as Bowman is a vocal critic of Israel. An estimated $25 million was spent on ads for this closely watched race. The Hill's national political reporter Julia Manchester joins us now to break down the results in New York and elections elsewhere last night. Now, Julia, Bowman was popular with progressives, but he seemed to rub many other voters the wrong way. How much did his stance on Israel cost him here? What else likely complicated his reelection path?
Yeah, Margaret, well, the stance on Israel was huge in this. We know that Jamaal Bowman has taken a very pro-Palestinian stance in terms of the Gaza war, and he made a number of controversial statements that pro-Israel Democrats and also Republicans were able to seize on. On top of that, you had AIPAC, a very pro-Israel lobbying group here in the United States, which has spent thousands of dollars funding Latimer. And we know that AIPAC has a pretty good record of very much boosting their endorsed candidates. So for Latimer, that was definitely a big plus. But when we go back to this Israel issue, I think it's important to point out that this district, even though it encompasses or includes parts of New York City, it goes into Westchester County, just outside of New York City, and it includes a rather large Jewish population. So I think his comments on Israel, his stance on Israel, didn't necessarily play very well with these voters. And he also had a lot of big ad money spent against him by his fellow Democrats and AIPAC.
Just too much to overcome. Now, in Colorado, Congresswoman Lauren Boebert survived her primary challenge. This after switching to a solidly red Republican district and narrowly getting reelected in 2022. Julia, looks like she made the right career move here. I mean, her political career was on the line. So is her new district any easier to win?
Absolutely. I think Lauren Boebert is definitely, on track to win this district in November. Obviously, anything could happen. If we go back to the 2022 midterms, we weren't exactly expecting her to have as close of a race as she ended up having. But this district is much more solidly Republican. And, it encompasses some of the outside Denver area, which includes a lot of very conservative communities, rural communities, farmland, and that definitely bodes well for Boebert. So she appears to be on track to win this. So definitely the smart career move, and she probably has less of a chance of having such a close re-election battle compared to 2 years ago.
Breaking down some other primaries where Trump weighed in, it looks like both in a South Carolina Republican runoff and a Colorado district where Trump-backed candidates were running, they ended up losing. Julia, talk about the dynamics here. It seems like no other politician can match Trump's influence, yet how do we explain these losses?
Look, former President Trump has seen throughout this primary cycle and other past primary cycles that his endorsement is gold in many ways. It somehow has been able to launch a lot of these candidates to victory. However, in these two districts in South Carolina and Colorado, you had more moderate Republicans that were elected. And this should be a bit of a warning sign to Donald Trump that not every candidate he associates himself with and not every voter in very Republican districts are necessarily swayed by his endorsement. So definitely the beginning of a loss for Donald Trump when it comes to his own, his own endorsement and the weight of that endorsement. Now, this was the first loss he's seen, or first two losses he's seen this primary cycle. So he still has a pretty good record. But if I were Trump and people working for Trump, keep an eye on that, because that doesn't necessarily mean that Trump is a guaranteed winner with other Republicans.
The Trump endorsement might have some limits. Now, another race where Trump's pick actually lost, Utah, where Congressman John Curtis won the GOP primary to succeed Senator Mitt Romney, who we know is retiring. Romney is a known critic of the former president. Julia, is Curtis expected to play a similar role to Romney in the Senate if he is elected?
Yeah, look, Utah is a very interesting state because you have figures like Curtis, like Mitt Romney, like Spencer Cox, the governor, who are more moderate Republicans, and not even moderate in the sense of policy, but they're not willing to toe the party line when it comes to Donald Trump. Now, we've heard Curtis say that he supports Donald Trump, but there are some issues that he, disagrees with, and he's also, has a record of maybe reaching across the aisle to work with Democrats. But in terms of Trump's endorsement in Utah, look, even though Utah is a very red conservative state, Trump has rubbed a lot of the voting population, particularly Mormons, the wrong way with his chatter and his rhetoric on immigration and refugees. So once again, it goes to show that there certainly are weak spots when it comes to the former president's backing.
And we are just a day away from Donald Trump and President Biden facing off in the first presidential debate of 2024. Julia, this is, of course, a high-stakes moment for both campaigns. Talk about how Trump and Biden are preparing for Thursday's primetime event.
Well, President Biden has been at Camp David this week. His campaign is holding a number of events this week in preparation. We have surrogates from both campaigns out there in the media chatting with journalists and, essentially setting expectations. Now, it's interesting because for so many months, we've heard President Trump talk about or make fun of Biden's mental acuity, saying he's too old, saying he's not really with it. But we've seen him in the campaign sort of take a turn when it comes to this rhetoric and instead say that President Biden is a formidable debater and that he can rise to the occasion. You have Democrats also pointing out that President Biden certainly rose to the occasion during the State of the Union address, something that was also considered very high stakes for him. So, for Biden, there is a lot of pressure on his mental acuity, his mental sharpness, et cetera. But with Trump, there's a real question of which version of Trump will show up. Will it be teleprompter Trump, where he's very much on message, focused, and focusing on policy, not making these personal attacks on Biden, or even sometimes the debate moderators themselves? Or is he erratic? Is he the version of Trump we see at these rallies when he is very much feeding off the energy of those around him and appealing to his base? Remember, he's trying to, in these debates, appeal to a much wider audience. So the messaging and tactics he uses during a campaign rally may not fly the same way during a debate.
Both men clearly taking debate prep seriously. Now, hovering over the debate, the Supreme Court will soon rule, maybe as soon as today, on whether former President Trump is immune from prosecution for any actions he took while in office. How could this ruling play out in the debate, Julia? Is Biden expected to remind voters of the crimes Trump is accused of committing?
Well, look, there's a double-edged sword for Biden. Biden could very well bring up Trump's guilty verdict. He could bring up his legal issues in an effort to contrast himself with Trump. The issue with that strategy is that Trump can turn around and say, well, look at your son. Your son has been found guilty. Your son still has another trial to go through. Don't throw rocks at glass houses, if you will. So going forward, it's going to be difficult for Biden, I think, to make that case. But, I'm curious to see whether Trump brings this up. Does Trump bring up Hunter Biden? Does Trump bring up this immunity case if it rules in his favor? Does he use this opportunity to rail against the Supreme Court or talk about his conservative, appointments to the Supreme Court? It's very difficult and a very awkward situation for both of these candidates, considering Hunter Biden and former President Trump's guilty verdicts. But we'll have to see what happens. I think ultimately a lot of voters watching this debate want to hear more about policies and things impacting them every day. And these two guilty verdicts, while they're very important and they're big news stories, they don't impact Americans the same every day like, say, the economy does.
I do want to ask you about this foreign policy. It's expected to be a big part of the debate. Which issue divides the candidates more, the Israel-Hamas war or the war in Ukraine? How do you expect that to play out Thursday night?
So with Israel and Hamas, it's interesting because Biden has arguably taken a very pro-Israel stance, but we've seen Republicans like Trump say he needs to go even further in that stance and that he's not being pro-Israel enough. And you've seen a lot of Republicans try to tie Biden to Democrats who have been pro-Palestinian, like Jamaal Bowman, for example. So I think you could see Trump take that opportunity there. He knows that this is a weak spot for President Biden. Now, with Ukraine, it's a different scenario because you have Republicans who are actually very divided in terms of support for Ukraine. You have a lot more moderate Republicans who want to see more funding for Ukraine, while conservatives don't want to see that funding. So Joe Biden could also take a swipe at Donald Trump over that. But Donald Trump could, make this case, this America First case that he's been making for years now, talking about how we're spending so much money on these foreign wars that we should put our own, the U.S.'s priorities front and center first when it comes to where we essentially spend our money. So I think it could go a number of different ways, but these two foreign policy issues certainly exposing divides in both parties.
Turning to another topic, former Republican Congressman Adam Kinzinger endorsed President Biden this morning. He released a video saying he is, quote, a proud conservative, and went on to bash Trump as a threat to American values. Julia, no surprise here, really, right? I mean, he's been a staunch critic of Trump for a while now. How do you expect this to translate into a boost for Biden?
Yeah, no surprise here. I don't know if it's necessarily a boost for Biden or if it really ultimately makes any impact. Adam Kinzinger, like you said, he's been a very vocal critic of former President Trump's, has been, said things in support of Biden in television and media. So I don't know if this necessarily translates into anything except maybe an opportunity for the Biden campaign to grab some headlines.
Maybe some Haley voters or likely voters might take notice, but Speaker Mike Johnson is leading an effort to file a legal brief in support of Steve Bannon's appeal to the Supreme Court to stay out of prison. As we know, Bannon was convicted of not complying with a congressional subpoena. What's the argument from Johnson here? Why is he and other members of Congress pushing for Bannon to remain out of jail?
Well, look, Mike Johnson and conservatives, as well as Donald Trump, view this, Steve Bannon's sentencing as an attack on that wing of the party, and they're pushing back against this, what they say is a legal bias against Republicans, and how there's this idea that Democrats are essentially trying to jail Republicans or target them legally. So that's what you're seeing Speaker Johnson do. This is very much an appeal to the conservative Republican base at the end of the day.
We'll see how that plays out. The Hill's Julia Manchester, thank you so much for all your insight.
Thank you.
A new lawsuit filed this week claims that independent presidential candidate RFK Jr. is ineligible for the ballot in New Jersey. In the newly filed suit, New York's Scott Salmon, a Democratic election lawyer, argues that RFK Jr.'s candidacy violates New Jersey's sore loser law. The law prevents candidates from running as an independent in general elections after seeking a major party's nomination. Kennedy has previously entered the 2024 presidential race as a Democratic candidate, but before the primaries switched to an independent candidate. Salmon argues that RFK Jr. first campaigned as a Democrat and solicited over $350,000 in donations from New Jersey residents, which should qualify Kennedy under the sore loser provision. Congress will soon face a new battle over wealth tax. A recent Supreme Court decision has effectively punted the wide-ranging question on taxation back to Congress. While the argument of a wealth tax was not directly before the court, the ruling has made it possible for Congress to expand taxes on billionaires. In the case Moore versus U.S., justices considered the constitutionality of a new tax code that was imposed under former President Trump. That code applies to certain income earned by businesses overseas. In a 7-2 ruling, justices avoided the most wide-ranging questions on taxation, while also leaving the door open to a possible tax on net worth. If the justices had ruled against the Trump-era tax code, it essentially would have ruled a future federal wealth tax unconstitutional. But now the ruling puts pressure on Congress to come up with legislation, leaving a fight to come if lawmakers look to adopt a future wealth tax. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention is warning increased risk of dengue fever. The agency issued a warning for a heightened risk of the virus, which is spread by mosquitoes. Cases continue to rise around the globe, with countries in the Americas reporting the highest number of cases to date. There has been 9.7 million cases in 2024 alone, more than twice the number of cases in 2023. The CDC says those affected could experience fever, headache, nausea, vomiting, rash, muscle and joint pain, and minor bleeding. That's today's Daily Debrief. I'm Margaret Chadbourn. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe to The Hill's YouTube channel. And come back here soon for the intersection between politics and policy.